Everyone. Welcome everyone to another great event by class and co-sponsored by us, Abbasi Problem Studies. I'm the Associate Director of the Abbasi program. So a lot of centers and programs came together to host Orçun Selçuk, a dear friend of mine and a very good political scientist teaching at Luther College. So today's book talk is on Orçun's book, The Authoritarian Divide, Populism, Propaganda, and Polarization in Latin America and Turkey. So in the context of global decline of democracy, The Authoritarian Divide analyzes the tactics that populist leaders in Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, Venezuela, Hugo Chávez, and Ecuador, Rafael Correa, have used to polarize their countries. Political polarization is traditionally viewed as the result of competing left and right ideologies. In this book, Orçun Selçuk argues that regardless of ideology, polarization is driven by dominant populist leaders who deliberately divide constituents by cultivating a dichotomy of inclusion and exclusion. This practice, known as affective leader polarization, stymies compromise and undermine the democratic process. So this is like to feature this talk. This book is very important in a number of different ways. First, as you know, people in Latin America doing Latin American political science and people doing Middle East politics and Turkish politics, they don't speak to each other that much. So he's bridging a lot of gaps here. One of them is that Middle East studies and Latin American studies, although there are so many comparable cases and comparable themes, they are really bridged by scholars, as Orçun Selçuk. Another one is generally people divide right-wing populists and left-wing populists and associate right-wing as I guess he's gonna explain it further. Right-wing as exclusionary, left-wing as inclusionary. So he's bridging actually these two gaps too, like to say the ideology is a secondary matter in this case to the real commonality that is about populism and that is about effective leader, polarization. And another thing is he's bringing together polarization, that literature. Second, he's bringing together that with what was the second one? Populism, polarization, and opposition. Yeah. So sorry, I forgot to. This program is co-sponsored by Center for Latin America, American Studies, Abbasi Problem Studies, and CDDRL's program on Turkey. And also, this event is partially funded by Stanford Global Studies Oceanic Imaginaries, a multi-year initiative that adopts the world's ocean as an analytical framework for advancing cross-regional, interdisciplinary research and activities addressing timely global topics. Orçun Selçuk is an associate professor of political science and director of the International Studies program at Luther College, Decorah, Iowa. He received his PhD in political science from Florida International University in Miami, Florida. He's also a proud graduate of Boğaziçi University, like many of us from Turkey, like me, in Istanbul, Turkey, where he received his bachelor's and master's degrees. He's researching the intersection of populism, polarization, and opposition during the global decline of democracy. In addition to his native country of Turkey, he has a deep interest in Latin American politics, particularly to the trajectories of Venezuela and Ecuador under polarizing populist leaders. Dr. Selçuk has published The Authoritarian Divide, Populism, Propaganda, and Polarization from the University of Notre Dame Press as part of Kellogg Institute Democracy and Development series. He has published journal articles in democratization, populism, Southeast European and Black Sea studies, and among other publications. Also, his public commentary has also appeared in the Washington Post, the Times, the Telegraph, Miami Herald, and CNBC. Please join me to welcome Orçun Selçuk.
Thank you, Khalid, for the introduction. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm particularly, again, really happy that we are doing this Middle East and Latin America at the same time, because most of the times when I give this talk, it's either to a Turkish or Middle Eastern audience or to a Latin American audience. So it's good to see people who are interested in Latin America. It's good to see people who are interested in Turkey and more broad issues and the topics that my book deals with. I'll just put my one here to keep track of time. So as Khalid said, the book was published with the University of Notre Dame Press in the July of 2024. And then last year, earlier this year actually, the Spanish translation also came out with a press in Ecuador. It's called Pescadito Editorial in Quito. So again, the English name is The Authoritarian Divide. The Spanish name is Populism, Polarization, y Oposición en Turquía, Venezuela, and Ecuador. Okay. So why did I write this book? And Khalid sort of already started talking about some of at least the goals of the book, some of the contributions that I attempted to make while I was researching, while I was writing the book. Obviously, the first and foremost, I am, as many of us probably in the room I'm interested in the rise of polarizing populist leaders around the world. But again, it's not just Turkey, it's not just Venezuela, it's not just Ecuador, but more generally, actually, leaders like Donald Trump, again, living in this country, are clearly a polarizing figure, or Erdoğan, the country that I'm originally from, or Modi in India, Hugo Chávez, Rafael Correa, but also Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, I think is a polarizing figure. Javier Milei in Argentina, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, and Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. So in other words, again, looking at global politics right now, there are several polarizing leaders, not in just Latin America, not just in the Middle East, but in this very country, or then more broadly in other parts of the world. One of the, again, reasons I wrote this book and I made this specific argument is because the current most common conceptualization of polarization in general was ideological. There is a more affective turn, and in fact, the person who came up with the concept of affective polarization, he teaches at Stanford, Shantu Iyengar, in the political science department. It started in the American context, basically studying how emotions matter somewhat more than ideology. But again, when they study this topic, they look at it from the perspective of, for example, how Democrats and Republicans, they're less likely to hang out with one another, they're less likely to get married to one another. They basically have increasing dislike of the opposing party and an increasing like almost of their own party. So in other words, again, the focus has always, and also in the comparative context outside of the United States, focuses on the parties. But again, in my book, in this talk also, I do want to push forward a more leader-centric understanding of polarization. And then the second motivation, when I read the literature on populism, there was this issue that I always had, which is when a leader is left-wing, we tend to assign the inclusionary label to that leader. And when a leader is right-wing, we just say that's an exclusionary populist. Or if a leader is from Latin America, we just say inclusionary populist. Or if a leader is European, then we say exclusionary populist. And that's, again, another issue in the literature, another problem I have when it comes to literature on populism. And then again, the third area, again, as Khalid mentioned, is this growing interest in opposition studies in populism. opposition to populist leaders, parties, opposition to polarization, opposition to authoritarianism in the context of the global decline of democracy. And we have Orçun Selçuk from who's also at Stanford right now doing research in the Asian context. So in other words, the book is situated in the perspective of polarization studies, populism studies, and then opposition studies, but also not just in Latin America, not just in Turkey, bridging these two divides. So one of the main claims or one of the contributions of the book is to put forward a leader-centric definition of polarization. So instead of saying affective polarization or affective partisan polarization, I argue that we need to actually focus more on affective leader polarization, especially in personalized contexts, like in Mexico, like in the United States right now, more and more, like in Turkey, etc. And when I talk about affective leader polarization, I'm basically referring to a leader-centric definition of affective polarization, which is based on pro versus anti-leader identity. So basically, in countries that are effectively polarized, the main cleavage, the main dividing line in politics and even society in many ways becomes, do you support this leader or do you oppose this leader? And then again, that not only shapes political relationship, that not only shapes protest, not only shapes electoral outcome, but in many countries like in Turkey, in Venezuela especially, it also shapes social relations. So in Venezuela, if you're a Chavista, you're much less likely to get married to an anti-Chavista. Or in Turkey, if you are an Erdoğan supporter, you will not only be voting against the opposition, but also you're probably not gonna socialize. And I think does that sound familiar in the US context too? So again, this is a quote from the book, and I'm not gonna have a lot of quotes, I promise. But this is, I think, is a good summary of my argument in terms of what I try to put forward and how I distinguish myself from some other studies that were published on polarization. So again, in countries where an incumbent president or prime minister dominates the political spectrum, I focus on how the members of the pro-leader camp express extremely positive feelings and attitudes, such as I like Chávez, I trust Trump, I love Erdoğan, I admire Bernie Sanders, even though Bernie Sanders was never president or prime minister, again, could be an extension of this argument. Or I really respect AMLO, right? Or the opposite then is people who are the anti-leader group feel the exact opposite, saying, I really dislike Correa, or I highly distrust Erdoğan, or I hate AMLO, or I feel disgusted by Bolsonaro, right? Or I really disrespect Duterte. Okay, so I'm really interested in the coexistence of these two camps because these two camps live in the same country at the same time. So that's what I'm interested in. Instead of saying everybody hates AMLO, everybody loves Erdoğan, I'm interested in how a certain group of Mexicans, certain group of Americans, certain group of Turkish and Venezuelans really have positive feelings towards this figure. At the same time, other people have completely opposite feelings and attitudes. So in terms of measurements, and I can answer more in the Q&A or answer afterwards. In terms of how I measured, I use some existing measures. So there is this data set for comparative studies of electoral systems. And I use the dislike-like scale. So basically people are asked, for example, in the Turkish case, how much do you dislike Erdoğan? 0 being the highly dislike and 10 being highly like. And in the Turkish case, guess what? 0 and 10 are the most popular categories, right? So that's a country that's an example of a polarized country. In the Latin American context, and again, given we're in the Bolivar house and we have some students who are interested in Latin America, the LAPOP, the Latin American Public Opinion Project data, has the trust-distrust data on executives. So basically asking people, how much do you trust Chávez? How much do you trust Correa? How much do you trust Bolsonaro? I'm basically interested in how those are distributed on a 10 points, 11 point scale and a 7-point scale. I think asking these on a larger scale is really important because if you just ask people yes and no, that's then by definition looks polarized. So in other words, if I make a poll in this class, should we order pizza or should we order ice cream? And then if 51% say pizza and 49% say it's ice cream, it doesn't necessarily mean it's polarized. You might be ambiguous, but in many times in the media, we hear that, oh, that's very polarized. I'm really interested in how intensely you feel about it. So if we have a group that is very much a pizza fan and a very much, ice cream fan, then things can get a little bit tense. And in that case, we can speak of polarization. So in terms of measuring it, I basically, again, theoretically, before analyzing the public opinion data, I came up 6 distributions that we can see in any country at any point. Okay, this could be United States, this could be Turkey, Mexico, Venezuela. So again, basically this is on a 7-point scale, asking people how they feel about, let's say, AMLO. Let's use the example of Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico. If the distribution is basically close to a normal distribution, then we can't really talk about polarization, right? So there are very few people who are highly passionate about AMLO, let's say, or this hypothetical leader, and there are very few people who are very negative about that particular person. Or we might have a leader where the leader is simply very popular, right? So basically, you can have a leader where they're doing a great job, they have high approval ratings, and they're well liked by the population, and very few people really highly dislike this person. And in that case, also we can't really talk about polarization. The third one is also very common in Latin America, and Peru just had one. The president that Peru just removed, Dina Boluarte, in Peru. The reason why she got removed is because she was very unpopular, right? So basically, who in Peru today identifies as a Boluarte supporter? Not much, right? Zero. But there are very people who wanted to see her again, and we see that a lot in Latin America. It's very common, especially towards the end of a lot of presidents' terms, that they have, let's say, 7% approval rating, 8% approval rating, and their basically approval is so low that they're so unpopular that we can't really call them polarizing figures. But what we see, and the next 3 distributions that I'm going to show are what I will call polarized distributions. What we see in Latin America and elsewhere is in polarized settings is basically a weak center or weak moderate identifications, and then the extreme categories being on the higher end. So basically, I call this, if 30% of the people say I really dislike this president, and if 30% that I really like, and then it just goes 10, 7.55, so it basically becomes like a bimodal distribution. I call it polarized, but this is polarized also symmetric. So what that means is roughly the number of people who identify with the leader is roughly the same as the number of people who identify against the leader. Although this is theoretically possible, in practice, actually, we either have this or this, right? In practice, a lot of the times you have polarizing figures, polarizing presidents and prime ministers, who either have more supporters than their detractors, or they have more detractors than their supporters. So theoretically, it's possible to have a deadlock, and it's very close. But in practice, in a lot of the countries that I look at, in Turkey, Venezuela, and Ecuador, and beyond those countries, it's one way or the other. So I call this one symmetric equilibrium. The one in the middle, affective leader polarization favoring the leader. So what that means is polarization is actually a smart strategy for the leader, because they do have a winning coalition. They have enough supporters they can rely on. They're popular enough that polarizing almost half of the country, but not half, could actually be a winning strategy after election. Whereas in the last one, when the polarization actually favoring the opposition, the situation gets somewhat more complex, because when the leader loses the popularity and cannot recover that, then they have 2 options. One, they could be willing to give up power through electoral means. So if the opposition comes and wins in the next election, that leader can, that person, president, prime minister, would simply hand off the presidency, or to prevent that, then they need to increase the level of repression, right? So because if the elections are held fairly and freely, and if there is polarization, but polarization benefits the opposition, then it gets somewhat tricky for the incumbent government. I would argue Mexico right now, under AMLO and Sheinbaum, it's polarization, but it favors the leader. So in other words, there are more people in Mexico who are very strongly positive about the current president, the former president, and then the current president to some extent. Turkey, for example, I would argue right now is the last one. There are more people in Turkey right now who are anti-Erdoğanist than Erdoğanist. In other words, if there's a referendum in Turkey, just asking, do you think Erdoğan should stay or go? The chances are high that people will say Erdoğan should go. But we know the elections are not just referendums, right? And in 2023, Erdoğan was not popular, but the opposition candidate was also not popular, right? So in other words, two unpopular people competed, and then the one that was less unpopular somewhat won the election. So in other words, if you follow Turkish politics in the last few years, Erdoğan is not staying in power because he is still very popular. Because most of his time, Erdoğan was just in the middle because he was very popular, but at the same time polarizing. But I would say in the last 5 years, 6 years or so, Turkey has also become more on the lower right example. And I'll show a little bit of empirical results to back it up. So this is from Turkey, for example, 2011 and 2018. This is the dislike scale that I mentioned to you. So what you're seeing there is 36% of people in 2011. They say they really highly like Erdoğan. This is like the max you can pick. In 2018, that was very, very similar. Right? So in other words, Erdoğan, when he's winning elections in Turkey during this period, he wasn't necessarily, winning them because of electoral fraud. He was really genuinely a popular president. And then when you look at the dislike category, when you aggregate the first two categories there, 22%, and then 24% of the people were roughly in the opposite spectrum. Okay. And then this is again 2018, and I'm showing this because what I'm doing here is I'm distinguishing affective partisan polarization from affective leader polarization, right? So when you ask people how they feel about the ruling party in Turkey, which is the AKP, then you still get a polarized response. So it's still polarized. But Erdoğan, when you ask about Erdoğan more particularly, you're getting that 35% instead of 27%. So what this points out in my research, something that I think we need to study and understand a little bit more, is how these leaders have this genuine affective connection with their followers in ways that their political parties cannot replicate that, right? So in other words, this could be Erdoğan versus AKP, but this could also be Morena versus AMLO, right? So basically, in terms of how people feel about Erdoğan, how people feel about Trump versus the Republican Party, how people feel about Chávez versus the Socialist Party in Venezuela, how people feel about Correa versus the Alianza País. My argument, at least, is political science literature focuses excessively on partisan identities. We should also be paying attention to these leader identities, and we should probably pay more attention to leader identities in presidential systems and in Latin American countries, countries where political parties are not as strong compared to, let's say, Western Europe and some other contexts. And this is from Venezuela, and this is from 2007, 2008, 2010, and 2012. This is level of trust in President Chávez in between those periods. So compared to Turkey, Venezuela actually changed a little bit, right? But the overall distribution, as you can see, is still polarized. So meaning again, the extreme distrust and the extreme trust categories get the biggest chunk in the distribution, and the essential categories are somewhat somewhat weaker. So there are some other ways. Again, I did measure polarization quantitatively, and I'll talk a little bit also later more about the qualitative part, but I just wanted to give you some numbers to back up in the first place that these countries are polarized, and then later to what extent are they polarized? Are they very polarized? Are they moderately polarized? So basically, this is a table on the views, average responses to questions on the assessment of democracy and material exchanges in Venezuela between the supporters and opponents of Chávez, right? In Latin American context, we call it Chavistas, anti-Chavistas, Correistas, anti-Correistas. So again, in this case, it's Chavista versus anti-Chavista. And then what you're basically seeing there is across all these indicators, and I'm not going to go into every single one, but again, ranges from media freedom, ranges from how democratic the country is. If you talk to Chavistas, the country has never been more democratic, right? This is the biggest, democratic era of Venezuelan history. But if you talk to the anti-Chavistas, they're worried about the country's increasing authoritarianism. So that's how the authoritarian divide comes, because that's something that I also observe in Turkey, observe in Ecuador, observe in many other countries that we study in Latin America, in the Middle East, in the United States. The supporters of populist leaders, they don't think that it's authoritarian. They actually think the opposite. It's actually becoming more democratic, right? This is the true democracy, because in that sense, populist leaders, they never promote authoritarianism in the sense that they don't call themselves authoritarian, right? They actually call themselves as the true Democrats, as real Democrats who are fixing the injustices of the previous era. So to me, that's why it's not surprising to see on a scale of 1 to 10, Chavistas rated 9.25, and anti-Chavistas much lower, and political scientists, the experts, even much lower. So in that sense, there is a mismatch here within Venezuela, but also I think how we perceive these countries more broadly, because I think when we study this global decline of democracy, we do need to understand that the supporters of Erdoğan, supporters of Chávez, supporters of Correa, supporters of AMLO, Bolsonaro, they're actually not perceiving democracy and authoritarianism the way scholars do. And on the contrary, they are perceiving it in a much more positive lens compared to their counterparts in the same country, but also compared to their counterparts in institutions like this and academic forums. Okay, and then again, some more quantitative data. So again, this is basically the predictors of trust in Correa. What kind of people in Ecuador, Rafael Correa, what kind of people in Ecuador are more likely to trust Correa than distrust? Okay, and again, people who think the democracy in Ecuador is doing a good job, it's basically democratic, they're more likely to trust Correa. Economy is very big, and that's one of my findings in the book, that when the economy is doing well in the countries that I look at, people tend to trust. The leaders tend to get more popular, even though they might be acting authoritarian. As long as they deliver on the economic front, their authoritarian behavior and practices, they're not noticed by the population, and if they are noticed, it's not a big deal for them. And again, all these countries are developing countries, but I would argue to some extent this argument could be applicable to some developed countries as well. One thing I do want to highlight, the reason why I picked Ecuador here for the regression analysis to show you, is ideology is not statistically significant. So what that means is in Ecuador, being a left wing or right wing doesn't predict how much you will support, how much you will trust Correa. So conventional wisdom in political science says Correa is a radical left populist, but if you look at his supporters, actually Correa popularity or trust in Correa is not predicted by if someone is a left wing or a right wing. This is not the case in Venezuela and Turkey. So in Venezuela, if you're left wing, you're more likely to trust Chavez. And in Turkey, if you're right wing, you're more likely to trust or like Erdoğan. But I do want to highlight, because I think for the Latin American context, Ecuador is interesting because it just shows an even more personalistic type of populism. in the sense that even though he calls himself the socialist of the 21st century, when it comes to actually his popular support, Correa has supporters who are right-wing, Correa has supporters who are left-wing. That's why in the Ecuadorian context, to me, the main cleavage is not between the left-wing Ecuadorians and the right-wing Ecuadorians, but the main cleavage is between Correistas and anti-Correistas. So again, in the Peruvian case, that will be Fujimoristas and anti-Fujimoristas. So we should be paying attention to these personalistic identities like Peronismo, anti-Peronismo in Argentina. Education is another also is statistically significant in some years, but not others. But this applies to all three countries, that people who are lower educated, they tend to trust the populist leader more. And it's an interesting finding because I find this in both two Latin American settings, who are left-wing, but also in the Turkish case, right-wing. So, and that's something we're talking about in this country too, right? The diploma divide, the educational divide. So I don't really talk about it as much in the book, but that's something for maybe the students to think about. What about education and populism? Where is there like a negative relationship? More educated people are more skeptical or less trustful towards these leaders. So that was the polarization part, which is my dependent variable. So basically, I'm trying to explain polarization in the book. And this is basically the main variable that polarization, I argue, occurs, which is the combination of inclusionary and exclusionary populism. So in the populism literature, if you read this literature before, there are different interpretations, different definitions of populism. I use Kurt Wayland's definition of populism, which is more leader-centric definition of populism. And I really like this definition because it focuses on how populist leaders dominate their country. So this idea of personal domination with their omnipresence and a transformative mission. Okay. And I really also like it because it's de-emphasizing ideology and emphasizing pragmatism and opportunism, right? Because for me, if you look at Erdoğan, if you look at Chávez, if you look at Correa, these leaders had ideological labels, but I would say what made these leaders successful were these leaders were pragmatic leaders who had different allies at different points of time, and they were able to stay in power by entering into an alliance, for example, in the Correa's case with the indigenous groups early on, but then he clashed with the indigenous groups right after, right? Chávez, when he first started, he actually had somewhat of an alliance with the middle class Venezuelans, but then he turned against middle class Venezuela. In the Turkish case, again, Erdoğan's relationship, I think, with the Kurdish movement is, I think, very illustrative that early on he had the Kurdish opening, then the repression of the Kurds, and then nowadays, in the current days we're in, there's another Kurdish opening, which from my perspective is more about political survival than ideological purity or ideological commitments. So for me, the way I see, similar to Wayland, these leaders at the end of the day, they're trying to stay in power, and they are doing it in a pragmatic and opportunistic fashion. And I argue that populist leaders are effectively polarizing because they include their followers and exclude their opponents. Remember, in the literature, we tend to either say you are an inclusionary leader, so someone like AMLO, Chávez, Correa, typically seen as inclusionary figure because they criticize neoliberalism, they criticize colonialism, they talk about class inequalities, and then we say, oh, okay, that's an inclusionary populist. But I challenge this dichotomy, and I argue that populist leaders are actually inclusionary to their followers and exclusionary to their opponents, regardless of ideology and regional location. So you could be a populist, and you can basically say, I divide this room in half. These are the people I oppose. These are the people that I include. For me, the criteria is more political than ideological. And again, who belongs to the in-group and out-group, that depends on the time, instead of having this coherent framework. So what that means is right-wing populists are inclusionary to the members of their in-group. So someone like Bolsonaro, someone like Trump are inclusionary, but to the members of their in-group, meaning people who identify as a Bolsonaro supporter, who identify as a Trump supporter, they feel empowered by these leaders. They have a sense of belonging, whether we like them or not. They do. We know this. And then people who are on the left wing are not just inclusionary to everyone. Left wing also do exclude. They also need the enemies of the people. So in other words, what I argue is we need to study inclusion and exclusion empirically from the perspective of supporters and opponents of the populists instead of normative. Okay, and in the book, what I do is I study populist inclusion and exclusion through the analysis of Muhtar meetings in Turkey, Alo Presidente in Venezuela, and Enlace Ciudadano in Ecuador. So these are basically regular meetings that these populist leaders had, and I basically analyze the content to extract inclusion and exclusion. So again, this is the Chávez example, and I'm not going to go over every single detail of the case study. But again, we're in the Bolivar room, right? Bolivar house right now, and Chávez was an inclusionary figure in the sense that he did lead this Bolivarian revolution, which was promoting this whole idea of anti-colonialism, which was empowering the lower segments of the Venezuelan society. He used inclusionary slogans for his supporters. Again, the idea of creating like a new Venezuela. He even changed the country's name from Republic of Venezuela to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, right? But at the same time, I think it's undeniable that Chávez constantly insulted his opponents. He constantly called them oligarchy or escualidos, right? Basically people who are traidores, right? These people who are not real Venezuelans. These are traitors. These are Yankees. These are people who are despicable, right? So it's undeniable. So again, I'll be happy to go into the details of this, but I think I'm somewhat running short on time. I'm a little bit behind. But again, my argument, and I have similar tables in the book on Turkey and Ecuador as well. My argument is at the symbolic level, these leaders create the boundaries of in-group, but they also create boundaries of out-group. And then they reinforce these boundaries through constant symbolic appeals. The inclusionary appeals reinforce the boundaries of the in-group, and the exclusionary appeals reinforce the boundaries of the out-group. So this is Rafael Correa in Ecuador, who was the president between 2007 and 2017. Although he has been out of power since 2017, Ecuadorian politics is still dominated by this cleavage of Correistas versus anti-Correistas, which also shows that even when the leader is out of the power, this personalistic division can still endure, and it could still affect at least party politics. I think that the most common example of that is Argentina, right, between Peronistas and anti-Peronistas. So Rafael Correa, he was a leftist president. He was inclusionary in the sense that he rewrote the constitution. He rewrote it with indigenous participation. If you read the Ecuadorian constitution, it recognizes the right to nature, right to water. It talks about indigenous philosophy of good living. So it basically rewrote and redesigned the country's institution with the participation of the people. So in other words, he boosted political participation. But at the same time, he was exclusionary to his opponents. So what that means, he concentrated power at the executive branch. In his TV show, he would just rip apart newspapers. He would insult, he would sue newspaper journalists, right? Suing and going after people for insults and all sorts of things. The criminalization of the opposition, again, particularly the indigenous opposition. It was initially the member of the in-group, and then when they became the out-group, then he called them the infantile left, right? So again, the argument is, I'm the real left, and the infantile left is the indigenous left who are out of touch. So again, even like a division within the left, which I think is really important, because a lot of the times when we think about left-wing leaders, you might think they're liked by all leftist people. That's not true, at least in the Ecuadorian case. And again, this is President Erdoğan. He's actually the longest serving. He was the prime minister from 2003 to 2014, and then since 2014, he has been serving as Turkey's president. The main takeaway I want you to have from this table, and this applies to Ecuador and Venezuela as well, Erdoğan did make significant improvements in the lives of his supporters, especially in the first 10 years of his presidency. So in other words, there is a material reason why many people identify as an Erdoğanist, or identified as an Erdoğanist and then stayed as an Erdoğanist. So in other words, there is this affective relationship between, building, it could be building a bridge, it could be improving the school infrastructure, it could be any material improvement like free textbook, school lunch. So there are a lot of things Erdoğan did. I think many people in the West and the United States may underestimate. So what I argue is Erdoğan actually is a successful politician until recently in terms of delivering to his base. Right? So people who supported Erdoğan, they got something in return. But he did this in a very clientelistic fashion, right? So if you're a businessman in Turkey, if you're a businessman in Venezuela, if you're a businessman in Ecuador, and you are close to Erdoğan, you're close to Chávez, you're close to Correa, you're going to get good business contracts, okay? If you're an academic in Venezuela, if you're an academic in Ecuador, if you're an academic in Turkey who has ties to the government, you're going to get these good grants, right? You're going to get good funding for your research. While at the same time, if you're someone critical, if you're criticizing the Correa administration and you are, let's say, employed in the Ecuadorian bureaucracy, the chances are high that you might actually lose your job, right? In the Venezuelan case, in 2004, there was a referendum and people gave their signatures. What happened is Chávez published the list of people who gave their signature, and many of those people actually lost their jobs, right? So in other words, if you support me, I empower you symbolically, I empower you politically and materially. But if you don't support me, then you basically are subjected to these exclusionary material practices. So what that means, again, the job, services, and resources are distributed in a partisan lens. I think we're seeing this in the United States right now to some extent, right? That the cities, the states that did not vote for the current president are experiencing some economic anxiety in terms of federal funds. And in the Venezuelan and the Turkish and the Ecuadorian case, that already happened. And it is happening still in the Turkish case at least. So what that means is, again, materially, you're better off if you're on the included side. And if you are an opponent of Erdogan, if you're an opponent of Chávez and Correa, you will face material exclusion. If you're a mayor in Turkey right now, if you were a mayor in Ecuador under Correa and you're asking for funds from the central government, then the chances are higher that you're going to get denied compared to, let's say, being a pro-government mayor or being a pro-government businessman, being a pro-government civil society organization. So in other words, material factors explain both inclusion and exclusion, and both left-wing and right-wing leaders do both. So before I finish, I do want to talk about the opposition, because so far in the argument of the book, I give primary responsibility and agency to the incumbent populists, right? So I basically argue that there is polarization in Turkey, Venezuela, and Ecuador because Erdoğan, Chávez, and Correa, they polarize, right? But I also argue opposition, so opponents of Correa, anti-Correistas, opponents of Erdoğan, anti-Erdoğanists, and opponents of Chávez, anti-Chavistas, they also have some role here in terms of either reinforcing or mitigating what I call affective leader polarization. And what I argue in the book is opposition in general, opponents of these populist leaders in general, can reinforce polarization if they reciprocate personal attacks. So let's say if the populist leader is attacking you and you attack them back personally, you insult them, it actually increases polarization. This is really important. Dismissing the followers of the populists as manipulated, ignorant, and uneducated, right? So if you are, let's say, an anti-Chavista, and if you say everyone who voted for Chavez, they're ignorant, they're not educated, they're just getting free stuff, you're basically insulting. In the Ecuadorian case, there's a term for it called borregos. So that means sheep in Spanish. So what that means is, if you vote for Correa, if you're a Correa, you're a sheep. You're just blind to follow Correa. So what I argue is these type of stereotypes actually reinforce polarization. So instead of coming from a position of moral superiority, the opposition needs to really understand why the populist leader is popular and how can you break that popularity instead of dismissing people and the leader as a group. Because again, when you attack someone in the group, that whole group gets mobilized, and then so it's basically the basket of deplorables, or again, it's his supporters are garbage, things like that. That we also saw in American politics, I think, in recent years. And I also talk about engaging in violent protest, coups, assassination attempts are very polarizing, and it in fact solidifies the opposite group, and it basically becomes like a heroic story. So when basically Chavez survived the coup attempt, when Trump survived the assassination attempt, it became a big heroic story, right? Or the coup attempt in Turkey in 2016, the police coup attempt in Ecuador, what Correa would call in 2010. But the opposition can also mitigate polarization if it reflects on past mistakes, avoids personal confrontations with the populist in power, and then engages in what I call pro-democratic coordination. So reflecting on past mistakes basically means that the opposition needs to understand that the populists got elected for a reason. Because a lot of the times, the opponents have this vision of the country that everything was great in the country, and then this populist came and ruined everything. That's usually not true. There is a structural reason why that populist came to power in the first place, and you really need to reflect on that as opposition. Otherwise, you'll just be in the same cycle. Again, I think it's easy to respond to a president who's constantly insulting in an insulting way. But what I argue, it further polarizes the country, and that's not good for democracy more broadly. And then I would argue the best way to counter polarization is to put together this ideologically diverse coalitions. So instead of, again, just focusing on right wing, just left wing, try to bring together different groups in society who can agree on certain pro-democratic values. So in the chapter 6, I basically find that the Turkish, Venezuelan, and Ecuadorian opposition generally reinforced. So they made all these mistakes, but then they learned from these mistakes, and then they tried to mitigate polarization. So this is the last slide, and I'll be happy to answer your questions and engage the audience. So basically, this is the framework of what I just described, and this is from the theoretical chapter. So again, what I'm really interested in is trying to explain affective leader polarization. So why we have these polarization. My explanation centers on populist inclusion and exclusion, right? Inclusion of certain groups and exclusion of others. But again, the boundaries of these actually change from year to year, right? What I also argue that although populist inclusion and exclusion are the main factors, we also need to understand the opponents of the populace also play some role. So I'm not saying the opponents are the main reason why we have polarization, but what I'm saying is opponents have options in terms of how they respond. And in many countries, at least 3 countries that I looked at, the natural response is to reinforce, because when your group gets attacked, you just respond in the same way. And then to me, it reinforces this cycle of polarization. One thing I do want to note is that I'm not really, when I talk about the opposition, I'm not prescribing how the opposition can win elections, how the opposition can lose elections, mainly because paradoxically, polarization can actually be a smart strategy for the opposition, especially if the opposition has the upper hand. But the problem is, if you win an election through a polarizing strategy, when you come to power, you still have to govern those people who are the followers of the populist leader. So ideally, again, the ideal goal is to depolarize and also win the elections. But again, the book is not really about it's not a handbook about how to win elections, but it's really about understanding polarization and then how opposition can respond to this. Thank you for.
Can you fill the quiz?
Oh, hi. Hi, my name is Gilles. I'm in the international policy program here. This was very interesting, and I have a few questions, but I'll keep it to one, and maybe I can come back later. My question is, did you spend any time thinking about normatively how we think about polarization? I think the assumption from the talk that I'm getting is that polarization is bad, and so let's depolarize. But I've been grappling with this a lot, and it's not always the case, because polarization, could increase, democratic engagement, make people feel a bit more invested, and also reduce populism. I think polarization and populism can have this inverse relationship. And so I'm just curious if in the book or just by yourself, you thought a little bit about normatively whether polarization is always bad and the relationship between populism and polarization.
Yeah, so I would just say polarization is actually some degree of polarization is necessary for democratic politics. So at the end of the day, we need to distinguish what people are, different parties, different candidates are standing for. So I think in the 70s in the US, they called Tweedledee and Tweedledum. These Republicans and Democrats, they were so similar that it was hard to distinguish them. So some degree of polarization is, I think, good. But especially in the Turkish and the Venezuelan case, we have extremely high levels of polarization, and Ecuador to a lesser extent. And that has negative effects on democracy, because again, it undermines common ground. It makes every election the most important election of our lifetimes, right? It basically exhausts civil society. It turns into your civil society, my civil society. So I agree, yes, polarization is not always bad. And in fact, again, it could be necessary, but high levels of polarization. So some scholar, Jennifer McCoy, calls it pernicious polarization. So did I answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe we can get from students. Yeah.
Do we have some?
There's someone here, but if you have your questions ready, raise your hand.
Yeah, sure.
I think it's really interesting that between like personal polarization versus partisan polarization. And I'm wondering about your thoughts on the effect on democracy between two approaches. Because, for example, I think in the Venezuelan case, the idea that it's more of a partisan polarization allowed the continuation of the government even after Chávez.
I would say actually personalistic polarization is probably even worse for democracy because it undermines institutions further. Because political parties are still institutions that are important for democracy. And I think when those personalistic type of polarization is becoming very salient, I think it could have a bigger damage. But I guess the other side is when the leader dies or when the leader goes away, it could actually be easier to rebuild, right? So I think it's sort of like a double-edged sword. In the Venezuelan case, I think I'm not sure, for example, if I would call Venezuela as polarized today as it was. And I think the main reason is similar to based on also the previous question. Polarization is tricky because it exists in democracies. It exists in countries that are democratic but moving in the authoritarian direction. But we really don't have high levels of polarization in full-scale autocracies. Because in full-scale autocracies, you don't really have forum for disagreement. You don't have it because speaking up your views is costlier in full-scale authoritarian regimes. So because I would categorize Venezuela under Maduro, especially now after 2024 election, as a full-scale autocracy, we don't really know how polarized Venezuela is because we don't really see those contentious events in the streets. We don't really see what I see in the Venezuelan case is a highly unpopular leader, Maduro, who basically had to steal the election blatantly to stay in power. Rather than a polarized country. Remember the 6 distributions I had earlier in the slide. So I think Venezuela under Maduro is basically here unpopular leader. Right. So he is so that's why I wouldn't call it polarized at the moment. Yeah.
So yeah, because my question is kind of related to where you just left off there. Thank you for bringing up the kind of context of a political movement toward a more harder kind of authoritarianism in Venezuela, particularly under Maduro. I was going to ask you if, in doing this research, what's the relationship between the level of democracy as a political scientist would measure it, and how movements toward authoritarianism might actually affect the way that people perceive polarization? I'm asking that question because both Venezuela and Turkey, if I'm reading correctly, right, have had sharp declines in the level of democracy over the course of Chávez's 15 years in power, and also Erdoğan's 12 or so more, maybe years in power. So then we can speak a bit more about the Turkish case, because you partly answered the question about Venezuela. That would be super helpful.
Yeah, so the Turkish case, similar to other cases, and you're right in terms of making the comparison with Turkey and Venezuela, because those are two that experience the most dramatic decline in democracy. And again, Turkey, when Erdoğan first came to power, was I would call it an electoral democracy. It was never a liberal democracy, but it had some electoral democracy aspects. And then gradually, slowly, it crossed into the territory of what we call hybrid regimes, right? And again, there is, I would say, consensus, at least in the Turkish politics literature, that the country since 2013, 2015, did become a competitive authoritarian regime. And now I think what we're experiencing in Turkey since earlier this year, since March, especially with the arrest of İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, and the whole crackdown on the opposition, and at the same time, this Kurdish peace process that is happening at the same time, I think it's a matter of, is Turkey becoming a full-fledged autocracy like in Venezuela, or is this still going to become a competitive authoritarian regime where it's less competitive and more authoritarian? So I think in the Turkish case, that would be my take. In the Venezuelan case, I think the scholarly consensus is also it was a electoral democracy, and then it became a hybrid regime. And then in maybe around 2017, because there was a recall referendum that the Venezuelans again collected the signature, and then Maduro did not allow that recall referendum to happen. So some scholars call it, that's like the democratic breakdown moment. And then for sure, since 2024, when the opposition candidate Edmundo González won the election, and it, basically the military and the courts didn't recognize it, and they celebrated Maduro's victory. So I think it has become a full-fledged authoritarian regime. The Ecuadorian case is interesting, and I think it has lessons for all of us. In the Ecuadorian case, Correa is not in power. His successor actually betrayed him and basically turned against him, Lenin Moreno. But again, since then, Ecuadorian democracy also hasn't fully recovered. So what that means is, I think a lot of the time when we study these countries, we're focusing on, let's just defeat this, and then everything is going to be, back to, democracy. And I think we saw this in Ecuador, but we also saw it in this country with the Joe Biden presidency. So after Joe Biden came to power, we didn't have this flourishing liberal democracy, that the same challenges stayed. So I think in some ways, I think focusing too much on elections, focusing too much on defeating these populist leaders could also, I think, give us false optimism.
Yes.
Right? But obviously in the Venezuelan case right now, it's basically a very closed system, therefore it's really hard to, it's very similar to Nicaragua under Ortega.
Hey. May I?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, and then you can ask, and how much time do we have?
Hey,
10-15 minutes.
Okay, we 10-15, so we can get your question and then.
okay, thank you. Hey, this is great. I just wonder this populist turn, right? There are two possibilities, like for the opposition. One is a kind of democratic bloc. The other is a kind of another populist leader, right? A kind of, if you think about negative populism, positive populism, maybe, I don't know. But then, for the democratic bloc, the populist leader or populist authoritarian regimes can easily crack down and, you know, do all kind of look. There are all kind of mechanisms and methods that they can eliminate or marginalize or, you know, delegitimize whatever this democratic bloc. Democratic bloc doesn't work in Hungary, in other places. And that populist leader, a positive populist leader, as we see in, you know, in Turkish case, then it can be a target. And it can be jailed. It can be, you know, she can be, you know,
Exiled.
So, I mean, is it like there's no, I mean, it's very difficult. But I wonder if you say a few things about this positive populist leader as an opposition. What is the, how do you see that, you know, that possibility for the opposition blocks in different cases? You know, like, is it, maybe this is the way that the opposition think, you know, should go in various cases.
Yeah. So, again, at least in this project, I try to avoid saying that this is the good populism and bad populism, or positive or negative. But I think your question is interesting because I think that shows that new populist leaders, under what conditions new populist leaders emerge against populist leaders. And I would say it emerges in countries that are still democratic, even though they might have experienced some level of autocratization. So a country like the United States, you can still have like a left-wing populist, right? Let's say, who is emerging right now and then rallying people around. And I think we started in I think right now in the New York mayoral race with Mamdani campaign, right? In democracies, you have these new figures who can rise and then become popular. In competitive authoritarian regimes like in Venezuela and in Turkey, it gets much more trickier, right? Because when, even I think within the ruling bloc, there is not much tolerance for other charismatic figures, right? Because again, if you look at Chávez, if you look at Correa and Erdoğan, they not only suppress other charismatic figures in the opposition, but they also suppress charismatic figures within their own bloc, right? So I think in some ways, because these leaders want to be so dominant, they want to dominate the whole political spectrum. They want to dominate the opposition, suppress it, but they also want to dominate their own party. So I think it is possible new personalist populist leaders emerging, but I think they're more likely to occur in countries that are at least nominally democratic, so they have some level of functioning democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of press. But when freedom of press, freedom of speech is becoming costlier, I think it also becomes much more difficult for new figures to emerge. Another example I can think of is full-scale authoritarian regime, but think about Navalny in Russia, right? He was basically like an alternative to Putin, and then what happens to Navalny? He was poisoned. And so in other words, again, I think that the regime type is still very important. And I would argue populism actually populism emerges in democracies, thrives in competitive authoritarian regimes. And I don't think you need populism in an fully authoritarian regime anymore, because you simply don't rely on popularity for your legitimacy. Yeah. Yes.
You're already kind of answering my question, but I'm still gonna ask. I have two questions. First, like, so populism is more of like, from my understanding, like a political strategy, and authoritarianism is form of government. but to what extent, like, when do we know when is simply like a political strategy? Because in the charts that you showed, like the material exclusion, a lot of those characteristics also resemble maybe like what an authoritarian like person would do in their country. So I'm wondering how, as us as students that we're learning to distinguish all of these I guess different political strategies, like how can we distinguish like when is like just populism and where can we start characterizing it as authoritarianism?
So populism, again, there are different definitions. There is populism as an idea, called ideational. So just saying people versus elites. Strategy, populism as a discourse, populism as a performance. There's also performative definitions of populism. And then the way I view it, authoritarianism is a regime type. So even though I think we colloquially will say, well, this is an authoritarian leader, I think we should probably use the word authoritarianism to classify regimes. So what you could say in that context, a populist leader did this, therefore the country has become more authoritarian. That's how I would frame it as a political scientist. Instead of saying, I, for example, really don't like the term populist authoritarian leader, because I think it mixes both things. Because populism, against strategy, discourse, performance, and authoritarianism is a regime type. So that's what I would say. Authoritarianism is the whole. It's the same scale as democracy. You can be a democracy or an authoritarian. You could be more democratic. When you become less democratic, you become more authoritarian. Right? So that's at least how I see it on a scale. And then populism, obviously, there are different definitions, but the main reason I use this definition is the idea of dominance. And I look at these TV shows that these leaders had on a regular basis. And the reason why they had these TV shows is to set the agenda and dominate their countries.
What do you make of the argument that a politico-strategic understanding of populism risks drawing a false equivalency between the left and a nativist right? And I guess another way to frame that question is, like, scholars like Adolph Reed Jr. or Cedric Johnson have argued that right-wing populism doesn't exist at all, and that it's a term that's deployed to delegitimize the left by drawing an equivalency between a movement or a group of movements that have veritably and qualitatively more violent methods or worldviews.
Yeah, I think I disagree with that approach, but I understand where they're coming from. I think that's probably more it sounds more Eurocentric theory to me than a theory that would apply to other theories. Because scholars who study European politics, they tend to heavily focus on right-wing populism, and they also say fascism, neo-fascism. So again, I've never used the word fascism here because fascism to me is a much more of a coherent ideology. So I think right-wing populism exists and left-wing populism exists. But what I'm actually saying here is we shouldn't focus too much on right-wing populism, because what happens both as scholars and citizens, if you're someone who is on the left, center left or left, you tend to be critical of the global rise of right-wing populism and then turn a blind eye towards, I would say, left-wing populism. I think when it comes to violence, more than 7 million people left Venezuela, and that's, to me, violence. Again, I think it's debatable when we talk about violence, what type of violence we're talking about. But I understand, I think they're coming from a probably different disciplinary or different normative background. So I acknowledge the use of those literature, but I think people who are more positive about left-wing populism, or people who are who call right-wing populism fascism, I think they come from a more normative background, whereas I'm more interested in how the supporters of the populist see it. So again, it's not that I support the right-wing populist, but I think it is really important for us to understand, if we're interested in genuinely understanding why Erdoğan is popular, if we're genuinely interested in the appeal of Bukele, if we're interested in the appeal of Bolsonaro, Trump, we can't just dismiss them and say, hey, these people voted for them because they're, a bunch of ignorant people who believe in conspiracy theories. There is more to that story. And then the left wing doesn't mean it's all positive. And so that's my take.
Yeah, thank you for the insightful talk. I was wondering if you could say more about the dynamics of these populist movements rather than sort of analyzing them as they are. Like, how do they emerge? I think in your comparison, if we're comparing Latin American democracy with Turkey, I mean, is it Plato? Is it that like all the democratic regimes have some sort of universal principles, and within that game of democratic politics, polarization is always a move you can make? And if so, in what institutional, social setups is that move going to actually be attractive of political actors? So, I mean, does it come out of a vacuum? Is it sort of random chance, or is it this shared history? I mean, whenever I read like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, like I can always see in the liberals and the conservatives in the background, like there's some sort of relationship to that I can feel as someone from Turkey as well. I can see the relationship there. So is there some shared history that made you want to discover this as well?
Yeah, I think in all three cases, these populist leaders came in a moment of crisis, right? They capitalized. So in the Venezuelan case and the Ecuadorian case, again, after the neoliberal era, the inequalities, violent events, uprising. So again, especially in the Ecuadorian context, presidents who cannot complete their term. So basically, there is this appetite for populist leaders to come and fix things, right? In the Turkish case too, again, one thing that's, for example, common between Erdoğan and Chávez is they were both imprisoned. They like imprisoning people when they come to power, but they were also formerly imprisoned. So that gives them a victim narrative in ways that they can resonate with some people. In Correa's case, he actually has a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois. He's a PhD. He was a professor. But again, he learned a lot from Chávez. He learned a lot from the broader Latin American experience, and then he basically wanted to replicate that model in the Ecuadorian context. And then one thing I can also tell you about the Turkish case, which is also interesting. When Erdoğan first came to power, he tried to act moderate. Right? So there was actually, if you look at those democracy index, like the VDEM, there's actually some improvement in Turkey's level of democracy, and Turkey in some ways is unique in that sense. But that basically coincided with Turkey's European Union reforms, and there was this optimism about going into the European Union. And also when Erdoğan first came to power, unlike Chávez and Correa, he wasn't able to rewrite the constitution, right? So Erdoğan still has not written a new constitution. He would love to do that. He doesn't have the numbers in the parliament. And to me, that's one of the reasons why he needs the Kurds. So I think, again, what I would emphasize in terms of the causes of populism is capitalizing on this crisis moment, but also leader himself, especially Chávez and Erdoğan, has this charismatic appeal because they suffered in the hands of the establishment politicians. So in the Venezuelan case, again, Chávez attempted a coup. He was in jail. Erdoğan, he recited a poem, and then he was jailed. So again, and then that basically made a lot of people resonate. And again, what I argue, and that's also, I think, interesting when we fight or counter populism. One way is obviously to use the judiciary, right, to prevent populists, to come to power. So in Brazil, you might have seen Bolsonaro. There is, he is basically in trouble. But I would argue that process itself is actually polarizing too, right? If you talk to Bolsonaro supporters, they're going to see that as a witch hunt. So in some ways, again, there is no magic formula. Because populism thrives on victimization. Populism thrives on this idea of being marginalized. Although when they come to power, they marginalize people who are not like them. Yeah.
So this is very, very interesting and very refreshing to see this perspective. So I really agree with your use of the Orwellian categorization of populism, because I think the other ones create more confusion than clarity, honestly. I think particularly the rhetorical competence and others. But there is one tradition in Latin America which is very, very strong, coming from sociology, of populism as a transformative movement. And that's shared by populists from the 1940s and from the 1980s and from the 2020s, 20s. And that one is a little bit, it's almost like there's maybe, I mean, that relates to the question of the false equivalence, but there's maybe a point when somebody like AMLO or somebody like says, there was a 1% that was excluding everyone else, and those are the ones I want to exclude. And when they make these claims of a complete transformation of society, that really resonates very differently from a Bolsonaro that is trying to exclude anyone from the PT, and everybody understands you're trying to exclude half of the Brazilian population. So I don't know. I mean, I'm maybe not formulating my question correctly, but that Latin American tradition of a defense of populism, because that sociology work really says populism is a good thing. It transforms societies, no?
Yeah, and I'm not. Yeah, I understand your question, and I try to, at least in the book, maybe less in the talk, try to stay like neutral when it comes to is populism a good thing or a bad thing. I'm more interested in its appeal among the citizen. But something you mentioned, maybe one way I can connect it is this idea of refounding the nation, right? Both Correa and Chávez, they not only saw themselves as any other president, but they saw themselves as the new Simón Bolivar, right? Or the new Eloy Alfaro in the Ecuadorian case. And I think Erdoğan sees himself as the second Atatürk or Abdul Hamid in ways that he sees himself as this figure who is historic, who has a mission to transform, other than saying, I got elected for 4 years, 5 years, if people don't like me. So it's not seeing it as like normal politics, but seeing themselves in a almost like a quasi-religious way. I think Chávez and Correa can sort of make that claim because they were able to basically pass brand new constitution. In Erdoğan case too, so I think it's a convincing argument, because even though he didn't change the constitution completely, he made significant changes that the Turkish political system is completely different today than how it was in 2003. So I think the transformative dimension is very important, but often also I think falls short of, they often cannot fulfill those promises in the long term. One thing I didn't mention in the Venezuelan and the Ecuadorian case is the dependence on oil exports, because again, they are both Chávez and Correa's golden years were when the oil prices skyrocketed and they were able to deliver more. And Chávez died right after that, oil boom ended. That's why Maduro is, without any oil boom, he actually doesn't really have much to redistribute other than redistributing to the military and his cronies. But I think the redistributive elements and refoundational elements are, I think, particular, especially to the Latin American cases that I looked at. Yeah.
Yes.
Before we can do the last one.
Okay.
But if you can stay a little bit after, but we stop that recording. Just go ahead and have it.
Okay. A different version has been asked. Maybe they can.
Maybe you can ask me in person. Do you want to ask your question? Yeah.
Is that okay?
You can both ask, maybe then I can just respond.
Okay, so thank you for bridging this regionalist divide that we so often see in discipline, for the talk too. So I was really intrigued by, like, if you had asked us to guess what the graphs would look like over time, I would imagine that the extremes would increase, right? Because of the reasons you outlined, the inclusion, exclusion, strategic, inclusion and exclusion by leaders. So I thought it was really intriguing that for one of the examples you showed, so we see that in the case of Turkey.
Yeah.
One of the examples you showed, one of the extremes actually substantially decreases, I think.
Venezuela.
Venezuela. And so I think that gets at the point you made at the end, and so I wanted to ask you the point about how opposition approaches, how it can change, how people are just on the extremities of these graphs, they're kind of feel effectively about their leaders. And so I was just wondering if you have what explains that in the case of Venezuela, is there something that we can learn from this?
Yeah.
The movement and the extremes over time.
Yeah. Okay, a different version of the question were asked, but it was asked in a normative way, like good or bad thing.
Yeah.
My question is, can populism become a democratizing force, not good or bad, just in terms of the democratic indicators? And in that sense, was, for instance, during the first few years, was Erdoğan a populist or not in your framework? And another question is, can populists be unpopular? Like, because all your cases are like success cases.
Yes.
Can there be a failure case? And if there's a failure case, why did it fail?
Yeah, populists can be unpopular. If they're unpopular, they cannot win elections, or they can be ousted. Pedro Castillo in Peru, he came to power, he attempted a soft coup, and then he failed. Whereas Alberto Fujimori, 30 years before, he successfully conducted it. Yeah, so there is some selection on the kind of variable here, because I'm basically looking at some success cases, and the reason is I'm trying to theorize about this, and I'm using these cases to theorize about them. What was your other?
Democratizing force.
Democratizing force, yes. I mean, obviously they are democratizing in the sense that they're bringing people who are left out. So in Correa's case, for example, there is significant representation of women in Ecuadorian politics. So there was a woman defense minister under Correa, or people living abroad, the diaspora gained the right to vote for the first time. Or I would argue organizing mass rallies. In the Erdoğan case, before Erdoğan came, women wearing the hijab in Turkey, they were excluded, and Erdoğan was able to empower them into the political sphere. So I think all these leaders, they are democratizing in the sense that they bring people who feel left out and they put them in the political center. But what I'm arguing is, while they're doing that, they're actually excluding other groups who they think as responsible for that victimization. And then I think your question, it is a really puzzling thing, and thanks for catching that in the slides in terms of how the Venezuelan distribution actually varies. I don't have a clear answer to that, but I can maybe attempt one thing. One thing in Turkey that Turkey has and Venezuela doesn't have is the salience of secular cleavage and then the ethnic cleavage. So what that means is, in the Turkish case, it's almost like frozen, right? That it's basically, in Turkey, we say we don't do elections, we do census, right? So it's basically, in a way, the Turkish coalition, both for Erdoğan and opposition, I think was more the same over the time, so it didn't vary as much maybe, compared to how Chávez put different coalitions in different years. And I think Chávez's popularity also depended on oil prices, and that could be another factor. And then towards the end, there's an increase there, and that's around the time he got cancer. So I don't know if him getting cancer also created some sympathy for Chávez as a person. So this was asked to me in my dissertation defense as well. That's like what explains the different years. I don't have a clear answer, but I can just speculate, why Turkey is more fixed and it almost doesn't change. Because if you also look at election results in Turkey, it's always 52 to 48, right? So it really hasn't changed. It's always 51, 49, 52, 48. Whereas in Venezuela, it goes up and down, and Ecuador too. So I think that's a question worth asking, but maybe the best way for that will be maybe to collect panel data and then to see over time how the responses change.
Next book.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.